Okay.
Okay, thank you, Lauren. So we'll just today's meeting. So welcome to today's meeting of the Corporate Governance Committee, which is being held online due to the current situation. This meeting is being broadcast live to the public on YouTube, and for those not able to watch the footage live, the webcast will be available for viewing after the meeting. Firstly, can I ask that all officers and members mute their microphone until they wish or are invited to speak. When you are speaking, please make sure that your video is on. I will now go around and ask members to introduce themselves. I understand there's no substitutes today, so if I can, I'll take this in alphabetical order. Mr. Bolter.
Morning, Chairman. Yes, I can see and hear you.
Thank you. Mr. Kaufman. Okay. Yep, you're unmuted, Jeff. Yep. Can you see and hear us, Jeff?
Yes, Chair, I can see and hear you. Sorry, I didn't realise, didn't hear you actually.
That's all right. Right, so Mr. Orson.
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Old.
Thank you, Chair. I can see and hear you.
Mr. Poland.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I can also see and hear.
So, Mr. Richardson.
Yes, thank you, Chair. All in order.
Thank you. Mr. Sheehan.
Yes, Chair, I can see and hear you. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mrs. Wright.
Yes, I can see and hear you.
Thanks very much. Lovely. That's everybody then. So, the finalist item on the agenda is the minutes of the meeting of the 25th of November 2020. I propose that the minutes of the meeting held on the 25th of November 2020 are taken as read, confirmed and signed.
I'm happy to second, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Is there any dissent to that? So I take that as agreed. Question time. I've no questions from members of the public. That's item 2. Number 3, questions asked by members under Standing Order 7.3 and 7.5. I've received no questions. There are no urgent items to take. So we're on to declarations of interest. Have any members got any declarations they wish to declare? Terry.
Just my usual one, Mr. Chairman, as we got the Treasury reports as being a Lloyds Bank pensioner.
Okay, thank you. We now move to the main agenda items. As with all the following items, can I please ask members to allow officers to present their full reports before asking questions? To indicate that you have a question, please use the raise hand function and unmute your microphone, and I'll call upon you one at a time. To be sure that everyone has a fair share, their final say, I'll ask at the end if anybody else has anything further to add. So you all know how to use the raised hand function. If that fails or I fail to see your hand, just raise your hand physically. So the next item is item 6, which is the risk management update. As part of the risk management update, there will be a presentation on corporate risks 7.2 and 7.3 in relation to the Adults and Community Department by John Wilson, Director of Adults and Communities, Nigel Thompson, Assistant Director, and Kate Revel, Head of Service, which will be loaded onto everyone's screen and viewable on the webcast. So over to John Wilson for the presentation.
Thank you, Chair.
Good
morning.
Good morning.
I'll just load up the presentation. Whilst I'm doing that, I'll just give the briefest of introductions, and then I will hand over to my colleagues who will take me through the presentation. Hopefully that's coming up on your screens.
Yeah, that's on the screen, John. That's great.
Excellent, thank you. So I think committee had originally identified a corporate risk which was around workforce. We had 2 corporate risks around workforce in the Adults and Community Department. One was to do with the internal workforce and one was to do with the external workforce. Just at the same time, that committee had identified that they wanted to have a look at the external workforce risks. As a department, we had taken a decision to subsume that risk into a broader risk, which was around the sustainability of the overall care market, which includes workforce issues and pressures, is one of the biggest risks within that sustainable market. So what we're presenting today is the broader risk around the sustainable market, which will include the workforce issues, both internal and external. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Nigel and Kate, who'll take you through the rest of the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, John, and good morning, everybody. I think I've got about 10 minutes. Kate is in the background multitasking, so she'll be able to answer any questions that crop up, but I'll take you through 10 minutes, really setting the risk in context, summarising some of the key risks, and then set out the main mitigating actions that we're taking to manage the risk. So if you look at that slide that you've got headed external workforce, this gives you a broad overview of the external workforce. You'll know that most of social care is delivered by the independent sector, certainly sort of 81%. And in the last 10 years, we've seen some trends around the workforce continuing to shift away from local authority jobs and towards the independent sector. Jobs in domiciliary services, as opposed to residential, have increased at a faster rate. And registered nurses are one of the only job roles in adult care to see a significant decrease, down 30%. Since 2012 to 13. And we think the reason for that is related to recruitment and retention issues, losing nurses to the NHS who have different terms and conditions, but also might have come about as a result of some organisations creating nursing assistant associate roles that take on some tasks that have previously been carried out by nurses. So we can move on to the next slide. This sort of summarises some of the workforce issues. There's a high turnover rate in Leicestershire, 38.6 against a national average of 30.4. And a lot of that lost workforce, they move out of the sector. Which means that they don't go on to other jobs within the sector. And this can sometimes is usually associated with those posts with less than 1 year's experience. And that tells us that this might be because there's been some of the hiring in that sector is wrong, recruiting people that don't necessarily have the correct values, or attitudes to work within social care. So they move off into other sectors. And the turnover rate's also higher for domiciliary care providers than for other types. Other reasons for why that might be around pay and conditions, possibly lack of recognition, leadership, development, and possibly sort of workplace culture within those organisations. And if we have a look at the sort of medium-term focus, 2020 to 35, if we look at Leicestershire as opposed to the East Midlands, there's scope for an additional 10,000 jobs over that medium term required to maintain services. We go on to the next slide. This sort of gives a summary of care quality across the area. So you can see that, you know, sort of 75-7% of provision rated outstanding or good, but 23% collectively requires improvement or are inadequate. And that maps across, you can see, for homes, and community-based adult social care. So we move on to the next slide. This summarises some of the market risks, high numbers of vacancies in care homes, particularly factoring in the COVID pandemic, and led to lower levels of placements. We're conscious that since COVID, providers have been challenged by escalating insurance costs and an increased demand for home care as more individuals naturally decide to live at home longer, but they have got increasing needs. Nurses, the availability of those in nursing homes, again, as we touched on, due to competition for the NHS, and the ongoing viability of smaller providers offering services for direct payment. These are people that have got a direct payment and choose to engage with smaller providers, but because a variety of pausing services because of lockdown restrictions, that being affected. And the ability of day services to meet the changed demands of customers post-lockdown. If we move on to the next slide, again, following through risks. There's risks because of all of this in terms of declines in service quality, making sort of providers increasingly unstable and at risk of failure. Damage to reputation because of reduced confidence in care services and leading to potentially a risk of service users not being kept safe. Increased impact on the NHS, as we know, if inadequate care services are available, particularly when it comes to hospital discharge. If there isn't a good flow into care services, then it makes that people stay in hospital for longer, and therefore increases pressure on the NHS and the overall impact of COVID-19. If we move on to the next slide, again, high numbers of vacancies in care homes now, caused by increased death rates due to COVID and lower levels of placements as people not wanting to go into care homes. We've talked about the insurance costs, and I think actually a lot of that is a repeat of what I've already just said. So we'll move on to slide 7, which looks at mitigating the risks around this. So since COVID, certainly, there's been sort of 3 areas where we've tried to mitigate that risk. One is through engagement. And when the COVID restrictions began, we quickly established ongoing weekly engagement with providers and the sector. And that engagement takes the form of a number of provider calls. And we also issue a weekly support bulletin that helps providers keep on top of issues. It enables us to offer advice and support and help providers navigate really through the changing landscape of restrictions and guidance, which means that they can continue to keep people safe. In terms of funding, there's been a range of additional government funding, for example, the Infection Control Fund, which has been in place to support the market over the medium term. And also there's been a tactical and strategic response through the Leicestershire Resilience Forum, and at a local level within the department, a twice weekly steering group, which looks at some of the key indicators around the market to see if we can spot trends and take appropriate mitigating action on a weekly basis. If we move on to the EU exit slide, I'm not going to say too much about that because at the moment we're not noticing any serious flags that have come up as a result of the EU exit. But some of the things that we were planning for was a potential impact on equipment, supplies and services should there be any shortage due to the exit, and possibly the impact on financing of care homes, particularly if large scale providers are being owned and financed through European companies. But as I say, as yet, we've not seen any flags to indicate that that's something of concern currently. In terms of the next slide, mitigating risks, the external workforce, what we've tried to do as well is look at how we work with workforce pressures. And we developed a specific external workforce team, Inspired to Care, and that was agreed back in 2017. And the purpose of that team is to really look at ways in which we can improve the image of the sector, support the sector with resilience and growth, and also develop and maintain provider workforce in the external market, and not least also attracting a high quality workforce. We've seen earlier that if there's an issue in terms of high turnover because people haven't got the right approach to social care, we need to look at improving that. So some of the things that has happened just as yesterday evening, for example, we've promoted things like care professional awards, and there was an event last night which recognised across the sector the valuable work that the social care workforce undertakes. Outside of that Inspired to Care team, there's work happening regionally through LLR, through the Leicestershire Social Care Development Group. That's a group that looks at training, online training, and supporting leaders. But also ADAS is sharing good practice across the region and doing further work to understand issues and plan accordingly. As we move on to the next slide, again, some internal workforce risks. So moving from external to the internal risks and challenges. It gives you sort of like a background of the makeup of our current staff. Our turnover is around 8.8%. We're doing a lot of work in terms of recruitment and retaining social workers. Sorry, that's my timer, and ensuring safety and well-being of people who access services. Just move on to the mitigating risk slide on that. To conclude, you know that we've been working on a target operating model to make sure that our practice improvement, it continues to improve, and we embed that into the organisation. We're looking at ways in which we can support professional pathways, so through the Assessed and Supported Year in Employment, ASYE, which hopefully this isn't something that happens across all authorities, but if we've got a system in place for supporting people when they enter social care as a career, that they've got some support through that first year, is a way of attracting people into the service. And the newly qualified occupational therapists, the NQOT, not currently in place, but looking to work with supporting OTs through their first year. Just that last slide gives you just some examples of some of the comms and the work around the sector. And I think probably we've just ran out of time, so we've got about 5 or 6 minutes for questions.
Okay, that's very comprehensive. Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation. It's excellent. Now, I have a couple of questions. If I could ask, invite Jeffrey Kaufman, you have your question, if you could ask your question.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. In the earlier slides, you spoke about leaving the European Union, and as a you feel it's not had the effect that we feared it may have. On page 14 of the report, you talk about risks removed, and we've removed 6.1, which I understand because we have left the European Union. But do you not think it ought to be replaced by something else? Because every day we find that something comes out of the woodwork in relation to the Christmas Eve agreement. One day it's the fish they can't get rid of. Another day it's the musicians can't earn a living. And I know from my own family's business the problems my son happens to have a refrigeration company, and the problems he is of importing something from Northern Ireland, a part for a refrigerator. Every day there seems to be something else. So do you think that risk ought to be reworded to some to the effect, we have a risk until we know how it's operating, or something like that? I'll accept change because the situation has changed, but I don't think we should drop it altogether, and I wonder what the comments would be. Thank you.
John, did you want to respond to that? I mean, just in terms of, yes, thank you for that point. It is early days in terms of that tactically across the authority. We do have an internal European exit group that meets on a weekly basis just to pick up anything in terms of emerging trends that we might be aware of. I think I'm just saying at this point in time, and it is early days as we progress into that new landscape, we're not seeing anything, and I don't think we're hearing anything from our providers around that issue at the current time.
No,
surely, Chair, it's a risk, is it not?
I think it's a risk that they seem to be managing. I just invite Neil Jones to make a comment.
Yes, Chair, thank you. I just want to sort of outline that Mr. Kaufman is talking about the content of the detailed risk register and the process to remove that risk from the register. Unfortunately, the team who's done the presentation today wouldn't have been aware of that. I think they focused, primarily on the impact on their specific services. So I think I've made a note of Mr. Kaufman's question, and in terms of the broader impact. But I think I just wanted to explain there that unfortunately the two have got intermingled. So the conversation regarding reinstating the risk really needs to come back in the wider context, needs to come back through me rather than John and his team.
Okay.
Okay?
That's very helpful. Jeff Kaufman, are you happy with that?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is Mr. Bolter, Jeff Bolter, if I could ask you to ask your question.
Thanks, Chair. This is I think it's a declaration of interest more than anything else. I wasn't going to say anything, but Nigel mentioned the awards ceremony last night. One of my stepdaughters actually won an award last night in that competition. So by implication, I shall mention it as declare an interest in that. I don't know whether I have to or not, or what interest it is. It's
congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, exactly.
Yes, congratulations.
I think it's a good achievement. I don't think you could have influenced that, Jeff, to be honest, but thanks for declaring that. So the next question is from Sean Sheehan. If I could ask you to ask your question.
Sharon, yeah, the first slide gave us the two risks that we were looking at. And I note in the report on pages 14 and 15, the wording of 7.2 and 7.3 has been changed. And we're given the old version and the new version, but no explanation. I wonder if somebody could explain the thinking behind those changes in the wording.
Yeah, that's in the main body of the report. Is that what you're talking about, Sean? The main body of the report.
It was on the first. It was on the first slides, but it's also mentioned. It's also mentioned in the main body of the report.
It is in the main body of the report as well. I just wonder whether we could take that question, if you're happy, when Neil Jones presents the main report, because it is in there. Are you happy for that to happen?
Well, the only thing I was uncertain about was who to ask, because I'm not sure whether the changes come from within the department or from the audit side.
I believe it has come from the audit side, but it's a very valid question, and we won't let it go. So I'll ask Neil to answer that when we come through. And or Neil, are you happy to answer it now?
I'm happy to take it now.
Yeah,
I mean, primarily. The department is very proactive in its assessment and management of risk. So I think primarily it's come from a wider, again, looking at it in a wider context and some of the impacts it's had. So it's sort of been led by the department through into the corporate risk register. Some of the wording changes have been led through into the corporate risk register.
Yeah. So
Does that answer? You correctly,
not sure that answers the question. No, I mean, I'm looking at the substance of the. Yes, please.
Should I try and answer again? So I think what happened was that when we reviewed our risk management plan towards the end of last year, we were looking at the risk management plan. We had a number of risks on there which were to do with the external market. So we had a workforce risk, which is the one that Committed picked up on. But we also had a wider risk, which was around the sustainability of the care market. And we had an emerging risk around, obviously, the impact of COVID and the pandemic. And what we decided to do as a department was to bring all of those risks together into a single risk, which was around the sustainability of the care market, which includes COVID, it includes EU exit, it includes workforce pressures. So rather than have lots of separate risks all around the market, which would have similar mitigations and would have similar actions against them, we brought them all together and substituted them all into a single risk, which is the one that you see today.
Okay.
But there are two. There are two. There's not a single risk.
Yeah, so sorry, the second risk that you see today is to do with the internal workforce. So one was to do with the external market, the external workforce, and the second one is to do with the internal workforce, which is a separate risk and has very different mitigations and very different actions.
I think it's the other way around, actually. The first one's to do with the internal workforce, the second one's to do with the external workforce, but that's by the by. Yeah, I mean, it seems to be saying the same thing, but cast in a different way. I mean, the old risk 7.3 talks about the workforce, and the new 7.3 talks about the market, which I find a little bit curious, the fact that you've looked at it that way. But I don't know if there's anything behind it. That's why I was asking the question.
Yeah, well, I think I've just explained. The reason behind it is that the workforce is just one element of a wider risk, a broader risk, which is to do with the external market, which has a number of risks. COVID, EU exit, funding, sustainable social care funding going into the future. Lots of risks around the external market, one of which was workforce. We didn't want to have lots of separate risks on the risk register, so we thought it was much better to bring it all together with a single risk management plan.
Okay, that makes more sense now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. I have no other questions. A very comprehensive presentation. So has anybody got anything else they would like to add? I can't see anybody saying no, they haven't. I mean, I suppose in extremely difficult circumstances for everybody, it is quite heartening, although it's not ideal, but at least 81% of the provision is rated as good or outstanding. I mean, there's clearly work that needs to be done, but it is being done, and there's a lot in place, as shown by the presentation, to make retention a lot better, to make the standard of care better, to value the employees who are doing it. So really good presentation, worth knowing all this information. And thank you very much, both Nigel and John. So we're now going to move on to the main report as set out on pages 13 to 56 of the main agenda pack. Neil Jones, the head of Internal Audit and Assurance Service, will present this item. So over to you, Neil.
Thank you, Chair, and morning, members. Yeah, so it's agenda item 6, and it starts on page 13 of your pack, and it's the routine risk management update. 3 parts to the report this time. The first section provides members with information on corporate risks. Secondly, there's a brief update on the risks to the council achieving its service recovery plans. And finally, there's some notification about the annual review of the risk management policy and the strategy which has taken place. So in the report, paragraph 5 refers to the updates provided on each of the risks on the corporate risk register, and they are found as usually in the appendix 1, which is pages 19 to 29, and I will of course take any questions on those at the end of my report. We've just been listening to it this cycle. There's been some considerable movement in risks, which is a good thing. It shows that the risk process is dynamic. There's been one new risk added 2 have been removed and they'll be continue to be monitored at a lower level. Now, one of those obviously is the EU risk, which Mr. Kaufman brought up. I was trying to make some notes and also get into the meeting to explain. So I will listen to the notes from Lauren's taken later on to explain what Mr. Kaufman's further questions were on that. And then also there's been the changes to the descriptions of the further 2 risks. And then again, Mr. Sheehan just raised the question there, which hopefully has been better explained. I just want to point out that 7.2, which was reported on today from an ANC perspective, is actually a corporate risk across a number of the departments. It's a wider risk in that certainly children's and environment and transport have had trouble recruiting. So that's always been there as a wider risk. So we can come back to those later on in terms of the main risk register. Paragraph 7 to 11 in report, they provide a further update on the council's approach to planning its recovery from the impacts of the virus and how any risks to achieving it are aligned to departmental risk registers and indeed to the corporate risk register that this committee receives. The section this time refers primarily to ongoing service recovery. However, the update to the coronavirus risk in the appendix does report that work is underway regarding the proposed actions to support the local economic recovery. And the plans on that obviously recognise there are going to be large and complex projects will inevitably bring significant degrees of risk. So I'll be working on the officers working on that to make sure that those risks are aligned into the county council's corporate framework, similar to the recovery risks. And the final part of this paper, paragraphs 12 and 13, just informs members that I've reviewed and revised the corporate risk management policy statement and strategy. This is an annual exercise and the outcome will be reported and submitted as an appendix to the MTFS report to Cabinet and full council at their meetings in February. A copy of the revised policy and strategy is included in Appendix 2, starting on page 31 of your pack. I perhaps must apologise that the header page should have read that the department was created in, the document was created in December 2020 and will be next updated in December this year, 2021. There are some key points to note. Page 32, we've updated the policy statement to reflect the current and future events. Page 36, the council's current overall risk appetite remains defined as open and there's a definition of that. Page 37, the next risk management maturity assessment, that's scheduled to take place at the back end of this year, 21. I've added in on page 40 a section on the service recovery risk processes. And at page 44, I've added in the roles of the chief officers when they act as crisis management group during the pandemic, and also the role of the member working party on recovery. And finally, at page 49, there's confirmation that the committee is well aware of that risk scoring 15 above should be escalated from departments through to debate by chief officers and then potentially into the corporate risk register and into the domain of this committee. If we looked at increasing the escalation point to 16, then 3 risks on the report would drop off and would be removed from the corporate register and out of the committee's domain. So chief officers are keen to retain them at 15. I've also undertaken a quick comparison against risk horizon scanning publications, as we always do each year this time of the year, and just to provide members some further assurance that the council's higher graded risks in the committee's domain match those horizon scanning documents. So 3 parts to the report. I'll take any questions from members if they have any now.
Lovely, thank you, Neil. I have 3 questions. The first one, I believe, was Sean Sheehan, unless that's an old hand.
No, it's very much a new hand.
Okay.
Chair.
Carry on and ask your question, please.
Yes,
Sean.
Chair. In terms of COVID recovery, how far beyond the county council's immediate responsibilities are we looking? Are we looking at the impact on the wider community, such as the risk of higher unemployment, mental health issues, debt, homelessness, although I know that's more of a district borough council function, and also what's emerging now is disabling medical conditions amongst those that have recovered from COVID. There was somebody on Newsnight, I think it was, saying that okay, we've had 100,000 deaths, which is terrible, but there's probably 4 or 5 times as many as that people will emerge from COVID with ongoing conditions that may result in pressures on our services, if I might say. So I just wonder how far ahead we're looking and into what depth. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sheehan. I'll just answer briefly, and then if Declan's still on call, he may know a wider perspective. So I quickly reviewed this morning the document I referred to about the economic recovery, and certainly there is a wider perspective across the county there in terms of working with the Resilience Forum and also the LEP to really understand the impacts across on the economic perspective. I didn't read the detail sufficiently to understand whether that incorporates the sort of medical and mental issues that you referred to. But I don't. Is Declan still with us? And does he?
Yeah, I'm here, Neil. Yeah.
RPG.
I mean, to be honest, it's almost an impossible question to answer, just because you're right. There is a plethora of kind of potential issues coming out from almost the kind of the tangible ones we can all sort of see. Impact on services such as kind of buses as an example. Will bus services ever return to the normality they were in before? Through to medical ones that you've touched on. Obviously, it's come out a lot more with long COVID, isn't it, that it can lead to ongoing respiratory things. Through to areas like education, where obviously sort of children have been sort of deprived of sort of their normal kind of sort of teaching. So I think it is something that touches services, but where it's almost impossible at the moment is obviously the situation is still developing. We're in a lockdown in November, we're back in a lockdown now. So I think it's one of those that we're learning as we go through it, but it's going to take a while before we sort of do fully understand those impacts on services. But yeah, it's a good question, but it's going to have long-reaching impacts, and it is something we're conscious of, but quantifying it and dealing with it is probably sort of tomorrow's challenge almost.
Yeah, I would say though, Chairman, that we can do one or two things. We can either sit back and wait till it all materialises and then try and cope, or we can try and get an understanding ahead of this and then lobby government to say we're going to need more resources here because of these problems that we've anticipated.
I think a very valid question. I think there are national drives going in terms of unemployment, kickstart and various schemes that they're working. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, mental health, I think, is very much coming up on the agenda, particularly with the lockdown. But I see no harm in asking for more funds to see what we can do. But in many ways, I see it as Declan has said, the problems that are emerging are the ones that we know about are on the radar, I think, but there will be new ones constantly coming forward, and it is really a situation which no one could have seen. But I do think it's a very valid point, and I think there's no harm in sort of noting your comments and lobbying to see whether there is everything we can do. As a county council, I expect there is a limit on what we can achieve, but they're very, very valid points. Thanks very much.
Yeah. I think, if I may say, I think we need some kind of a recovery strategy so that we can identify all of the issues and quantify the resource that's going to be needed to deal with them.
Yeah, or indeed whether we are the right body to be dealing with them. Yeah,
the responsibility has to be shared amongst all the authorities.
Yeah,
yes,
I think you're
including
right.
Government.
Yes,
thank you, Chair.
Very much so. Thank you. So my next question is from Geoffrey Bolter. Jeff, if you can ask your question tonight.
I'm sorry, I haven't got a question. My hand's not up.
Oh. No, it's Geoffrey Bolter.
No.
Geoffrey Bolter, not you.
It's not. My name is not Geoffrey Bolter.
All right, sorry.
Bill.
Bill Bolter. Sorry, I get confused. Easily confused. Sorry, Bill.
Yeah, I did get confused with Geoffrey occasionally. One of my main questions, Chair, is we're difficult now. We had the Limes closed at Hinckley. Curtis Weston was stopped taking on people. How many more homes have we got that are in difficulties that we might have to stop taking people to? In fact, the real question is, were all the people who are discharged from hospital tested for COVID before they were put into these homes? Hospitals have just recently cleared a number of patients from their beds and took them into our homes. Were they tested for COVID before they went into our homes? Are we expecting another little unfortunate death rate in our homes? And have we got enough capacity left to cater? We've got these homes which we're not putting placements in now.
Chair, if you want to come in, I think it's probably a level of detail beyond what we've got to hand it. If Nigel and John would have been the people to answer that. I wonder whether, if it's the sort of thing, whether it's worth requesting this sort of an update on that at the all-member briefings that happen. It's probably sort of, you'll get a more natural kind of response, but that level of detail is beyond us, to be honest. Sorry, Chair, you're on mute.
Fully understand, Declan. I think it's a valid point that Bill Welter raises, but I mean, we saw from the last presentation there's a 10% sort of capacity decline due to COVID deaths within the care homes and various things like that. But yeah, I think it is something on a weekly. It is probably for the Director of Public Health really to answer. So if we can raise that probably at the next briefing on next Tuesday. That would be one to raise there, Bill, if I could ask you to do that. And then
can we have the what we're going to do about review of the bus service with the COVID?
Well, I think that we're going to bring that back. That's one of the recommendations. I thought we'd have a presentation on that in June, when the next meeting is, because that's another problem. So my next question is from Terry Richardson.
Thanks, Chair. Just a quick one, really. Following the court case that was widely publicised this week about the nursery in the Harbour area and a free place meaning a free place, are there implications on the county, and therefore does it need to go on the risk register?
I think I read the report the other day. It's clear there are implications for the council. I just wonder whether Lauren, I don't think Lauren is actually on the call at the moment.
I can answer, Chair, if you like.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Nick.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Richardson. Yeah, we did actually debate this in just before the November committee, because we were aware then at the time of the local government ombudsman's sort of view on this, and so we collectively, myself, Lauren, and Jane Moore, we took account of all the scenarios, and we just kept it off the, we thought it was just ready to be off the risk register at the time. Obviously, with the nationwide media impact on that, we raised the issue again yesterday, so it's on our domain. So I think it's a very valid question to ask, but we've just got to work through the sort of technicalities behind it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Neil. I just wanted to make sure, as I'm sure it was on the radar. Yeah. And I think it's worth the public knowing it's on the radar that we're looking into the implications. So thanks very much for that.
I actually, I don't know whether I misunderstood, but I think actually the report is going to the Cabinet fairly shortly. So hopefully, but yeah, a very valid question. Thank you, Terry. Thank you. I have one more question, I think, from Sean Sheen. Oh, just before Sean, I've got Lauren here. Would you like to add a comment, Lauren?
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, it's simply to confirm the fact that because it's a public report as opposed to an ordinary report of the Ombudsman, that's because the Ombudsman's identified it having wider national implications potentially. There is a requirement that it goes to Cabinet, and I was really just going to flag up that the Cabinet report has been circulated to this committee because of the crossover of interest, and I hope members would have had the opportunity perhaps to have a look at that. As Neil said, we were carefully considered at the time the way that we should manage this from a risk perspective. I think our take on it, to be fair, was that the issue was rather isolated to this nursery. It may be that there are wider implications, but until that's properly looked at, we won't know for sure. So that's really where we are with it. But as Neil said, it is something we need to keep under review, and we'll revise as the thing progresses. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Lauren. That's clarified that. I read the report. I thought it was fairly clear. And hopefully Cabinet will give it their attention next week or whenever it is. Now, Sean,
Yeah, it is on the same subject. I was just wondering how we managed to have such a massive falling out with the Ombudsman over this case. I mean, they didn't like the way we responded. And when you read some of the details in the Cabinet report, which I think is paragraph 2021, we're saying that the Ombudsman said we should audit all of the providers and see how many other instances of this top-up fee being passed on to parents and carers there are. So we were saying that's going to be too much work. We're saying nobody else has complained, which is interesting. And yet we're worried about the potentially massive impact of having to pay this money out. I know we're not here to debate this now necessarily, but I'm just curious as to how we've got ourselves into this odd situation. Is it common to have a massive disagreement with the Ombudsman? I don't think so.
I don't think it is, but I think to try and keep it in perspective, this is one person at one nursery complaining about an invoice, and I would very much hope there hasn't been any underhand. We have provided the free care. It's just making it clear on the invoice and the implications. But I will invite Lauren to make a comment on it.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I'm pleased to take the opportunity to do so. There certainly hasn't been a massive falling out with the Ombudsman. There's been a reasonable exchange of views and arguments put forward on both sides. That's perhaps a little more detailed than most cases, but I wouldn't say it's out of the ordinary, and it's certainly not been intemperate, impolite, anything unhelpful. It's simply the council putting forward its legitimately held views. So I wouldn't want members to think that there's a, massive issue with the Ombudsman over this. It's an isolated case, and we just need to work through the implications of it.
Well, can I just quote from paragraph 44 of the Ombudsman's report, because it says, paragraph 44, we are publishing this report because the council has not yet accepted our findings and recommendations. We also wish to record the council's unhelpful response to our investigation. And later on it says, in this case, the council has tried to justify a position it has taken without full regard to the facts of the case. And that's hardly complimentary, is it?
It's not complimentary, but at the same time, the obligation on the council officers is to put forward the arguments that it thinks are valid and reasonable, and that's what we've done. And the Ombudsman can make of that what they would, and they're entitled to do so. But I think the council officers' job is to put forward the arguments that are relevant and legitimate, and I think I'm comfortable that we have done that in an appropriate way.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Sean, for bringing that to our attention. I mean, as I sort of summarised, I think it's good that it's out in the open. It is actually one person, one invoice, which was not clear, and I think the Ombudsman is entitled to make his comments as we are back without any animosity or bad feeling. And I hope, I think that the assurance I take is that there is no intent to deprive people of the service that they're entitled to, but it will go through Cabinet and it will come out, and we will learn the ultimate outcome. So thank you for that, Sean. Bill Bolter.
Thank you, Chair. On the same subject, I think there's a time limit when it's got to come back to this committee. I think it's 2 months. So will we have a full report at the next meeting, what the Cabinet's decided to do? And what the Ombudsman decided to do, because having our discussion with Lauren the previous meeting about Ombudsman and their reports and what they can and can't do and what we as the council can and can't do, we seem to be at odds now with what we said at the last meeting, what's happening now. So a full report at the next meeting will be appreciated.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Bill. I mean, it is very clear what is the whole report. The Ombudsman's report has been circulated to the committee. It is going to Cabinet. I see no reason why the decision of Cabinet can't come back to the committee, but it will be. I go back to what I said before. I think the whole thrust and drive of it is really revolving around an invoice and the clarity that you have to show the charges for any services the nursery provides separately from the free hours, and to make it absolutely transparent. But I really don't think there's any question the council has not been on, doing its obligations, legal obligations, and that's exactly why we have an ombudsman, so that it can be brought out into the open. And I would ask that it is brought back and the result brought to this committee. So hopefully, Bill, that answers your question.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I mean, we are charged with governance, and this is the governance issue.
Oh, absolutely.
So we need to have a full report. Thank you.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Okay, so I have no further questions at the moment, as far as I can see. Has anybody got anything else they want to raise? They haven't. So, moving on to the recommendations, which are set out on page 16 of the agenda pack. Regarding recommendation A, the committee is asked to approve the current status of the strategic risks facing the County Council. I'm happy to move this recommendation. Please, can I have a seconder? Thank you, Terry. Can I take this as agreed if there is no dissent? And there doesn't appear to be any dissent. So I take this as agreed. Regarding recommendation B, a presentation on public transport, I propose that we have a presentation on public transport sustainability. I think this was an issue that was raised actually by the committee, and it's a very valid one, because if you notice, the buses are virtually empty at the moment. So let's have a look at that. Is everybody can I take this as agreed? Is everybody happy to have that? Thank you. So with regard to recommendation C, can I take these updates as duly noted? It looks as though we're all in agreement with that. I'll take that as agreed. So we now move on to item 7, which is the process for the removal of local authority nominated governors as set out on pages 57 to 66. Jane Moore, Director of Children and Family Services, will present this item. Caroline Woodhouse from the Children and Families Department is also in attendance to assist in answering questions. So, Jane, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everybody. So the purpose of this report is to seek the committee's agreement to the introduction of a new process to manage requests from maintained schools to remove a local authority nominated school governor, and to agree the delegation of this function to the Director of Children and Family Services. So by way of background, the local authority is required by the regulations to nominate local authority governors for appointment to governing bodies of maintained schools, and only the local authority has the power to remove its nominated officer, as stated above, and to do so currently must give notice of the removal to the clerk of the governing body, which is proposed to be removed, and then the LA governor. Given that such events and circumstances are rare, the County Council doesn't currently have a prescribed process for such a removal, and therefore the committee today is being asked to consider the options set out and to agree a proposed preferred approach. So we've set out a number of proposals that I'll just very briefly go through. There are 3 potential options for consideration of the request for the removal of of an LA nominated governor. Option 1 is that the Director of Children and Family Services be granted delegated authority to remove a nominated governor, following consultation with the Director of Law and Governance and the Chair and spokespersons of the committee. Option 2 is that there is a panel of 3 elected members be convened from the membership of the Corporate Governance Committee to consider and determine such matters. And option 3 is that the matter be referred to the Director of Children and Family Services, who will make a recommendation to the chair of the committee. And if the chair considers there may be grounds for removal, that the matter be referred to committee for consideration. So in considering each option, and the approaches adopted by other local authorities have also been considered, it is common for this function to be delegated to the Director of Children and Family Services. And it's worth noting that the County Council's Director of Children and Family Services does already have the authority to nominate local authority governors, and option 1 would be an extension of that delegation. To support this approach, it's also proposed that the process that we've attached as Appendix A be adopted. So just to move to the recommendations, Chair, it's recommended that the committee notes the proposed options for dealing with the requests, agrees the process for handling those requests, and makes the delegation to the Director of Children and Family Services. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I have two questions. So first one is from Sean Sheehan. Sean, please ask your question.
Yes, thank you, Jane. Again, I'm wondering where this has come from. I mean, I did 23 years as a governor in 4 different schools, and I can't remember this ever happening or ever coming up as an issue. And I'm just wondering how frequently this occurs, and how bad things have to get for this course of action to be contemplated.
Thank you, Chair. I'll hand over to my colleague Caroline, who's going to answer. But the brief answer is it's very infrequently that this occurs, and this is about developing a process that enables us to manage it should the matter arise. But I'll just hand over to Caroline, who will be able to give a little bit more detail around how often this happens and the severity.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Morning, everybody. The frequency with which it happens, I've been in post for 4 years, and I haven't been aware of this process being instigated in all of that time. If it arises as a matter of last resort, and that's the basic premise that any governor or trustee removal is approached on. I would like to provide my assurances that I'm very cautious about any removals, that there does need to be some form of investigation. There does need to be, I think, some form of third-party scrutiny as to what has happened. And I think this process provides those safeguards and assurances that this is not going to be something that is embarked upon lightly.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Caroline. That's quite reassuring. Now, Mr. Poland, you have a question.
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you for the presentation, Jane. I mean, for me, when I was reading this report, the thought that came through my mind, and I did 7 years as a local authority governor myself before I was a councillor, and is a governor more like an elected member or more like an employee? And for me, I get to the conclusion they're more like an elected member. And therefore, actually, my thought was going more towards option 2, if I'm honest. I think certainly it's a last resort. As has been said, I never came across this in my time as a governor. But I do think that if we get to a point where we're looking at termination of someone who is more like a councillor than an employee, I think it should be something that members have the final say on, obviously with the advice and consultation and process of support of officers. But that was more my feeling, if I'm honest.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for James. So the next one is Ivan Old. If I could ask you to ask your question, Ivan, or next thing.
Thank you, Chair. Basically, it's an observation. It's a process which is not going to happen very frequently. Usually it's difficult to get local authority governors in the first place. You're not overwhelmed, as it were, with choice. And having looked at the 3 options, I have to do personally support option 1, which I think is the most sensible way forward. But that's just my viewpoint, and happy to take the majority view within the committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivan. Yeah, I tend to agree with you, but Terry.
I was just going to say, Chair, pretty much what Ivan just said. I spent 21 years as an LA appointed governor, and again didn't see it happen. But it's sensible we have a process, and having considered the report, I would be happy to propose option 1.
Yeah. So final question, as far as I can see, from Bill Bolter.
Thank you, Chair. Now, Terry's already said it. I think we ought to move forward, and I'll support option 1.
Yeah, thanks very much. I just have one very quick question for Caroline. Is there a right of appeal on this? Because I think that's quite important to me.
I think the regulations don't provide for a right of appeal, but in the guidance that I follow, there is a recommended best practice that is afforded. And my experiences have been that if there is going to be a removal of this nature, then there will be something that is happening on the board that perhaps creates potentially difficult relationships. And whilst that's not a reason of itself to remove, I think that particularly with the stresses and strains that governance are under at the moment, that makes things very difficult. And I think the external scrutiny that will be provided by it being taken away from a board or whoever it is that has raised a particular issue effectively builds in that safeguard that there is somebody outside of the characters and people involved to scrutinise that. And it's something that I would be really keen to ensure is built into any process, because best practice says there should be the ability of an appeal.
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, I genuinely believe will only be in the most exceptional circumstances that we would move to remove a governor, because they do a lot of work and actually have a very important role in the school, and it's commended. We don't want people being removed willy-nilly because of character assassination or anything like that, and clearly there are safeguards in there. So I have no other questions. So moving to the recommendations, which are set out on page 59 of the agenda. Regarding recommendation A, can I take the proposed process options as being duly noted? Okay, so I have no dissent, so I take that as agreed. Regarding recommendation B, the committee is recommended to agree the process for handling requests for the removal of local authority nominated governors as set out in Appendix A to this report. I am happy to move this recommendation. Please can I have a seconder? Thank you, Terry. Now, is there any dissent to that committee decision? No. There's no, so can I take this as that there is no dissent and agreed? Yep. Okay, thanks very much. A good debate, and with regard to recommendation C, the committee is recommended to delegate to the Director of Children and Family Services, following consultation with the Director of Law and Governance and the Chair and the spokesperson of the Corporate Governance Committee, powers to consider and determine representation seeking the removal of a local authority nominated school governor, and power to amend the process for handling for the removal of a local authority appointed school governor as attached to Appendix A. I'm happy to move this recommendation. Can I have a seconder? Right, so that's Ivan. Can I take this as agreed if there is no dissent? Thank you. That's great. That's all agreed. So I think if the circumstances did arise, it will be reported back to corporate governance, and if anybody has any dissatisfaction, we'll take it from there. But I'm confident that the process, hopefully, it hasn't been used in 4 years, and hopefully won't be used for ever. But it's there just in case. So we now move to item 8, which is a regulation of the Investigatory Powers Act 2000 and the Investigatory Powers Act 2016, as set out on pages 67 to 74 of the agenda pack. Now, we have Gary Connors, Head of Regulatory Service, is with us, who will present this item. So good morning, Gary, and over to you to present.
Good morning, Chair. Thank you. I'll just try and just give an outline really of the subject area of this report and just keep it down to the main points, because the report itself is fairly self-explanatory. As indicated in paragraph 2 of the report, a local authority is required to set a policy which outlines how it tends to comply with the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act to ensure any surveillance activity undertaken is lawful, necessary and proportionate. And the policy should also ensure that all employees across the County Council have an overall awareness of what would be deemed to be covert surveillance, and that managers, if contemplating any such activity in their position as an officer of the authority, are aware that an authorisation and a judicial approval process must be undertaken before deploying any surveillance. So as indicated in paragraph 5, surveillance can be broken down essentially into 3 types. There is directed surveillance, which is at the covert observations with or without recording equipment. Covert human intelligence sources, which are essentially informants, but in a local authority context, this tends to be, in Leicestershire's case, trading standards officers who may be acting covertly to undertake test purchasing exercises, for example. And thirdly, communications data is another form of surveillance, and this tends to be around mobile subscriber details, somebody's internet protocol, but not the content of a communication. That's the important factor. We are not a relevant authority to be able to obtain the content of a communication. An example to establish what I mean by this is if we took a rogue trader complaint who may be targeting a vulnerable and elderly person, and we have a single mobile phone number to go on to be able to identify who that rogue trader was that committed the fraud on the doorstep, then we would use this approach in order to obtain the subscriber details of that particular phone number. Paragraph 14 does provide a breakdown of the authorised surveillance activity that's undertaken by this council over the last 14 months or so. You'll note the level of activity has been relatively low, all of which, all the surveillance activity there relates to trading standards investigations. Surveillance is resource intensive, and some of our trading standards investigations, which may utilise surveillance techniques, have been scaled back recently due to additional demands on the service. And since COVID, there are issues around securing court time when applying for surveillance to get it authorised, because that does require judicial approval by the magistrates' courts. With directed surveillance and covert human intelligence sources, there is an authorisation process, and that's both internal and this requirement to obtain judicial approval through the magistrates' courts. Communications data is slightly different. We have to go through a fairly rigorous, equally rigorous process, which involves using the National Anti-Fraud Network, which is actually hosted by Gateshead Council. And we have to go through a number of gateways before we can obtain that communications data. We're also placed under a further scrutiny by the Investigatory Powers Commissioner's Office, and they have previously undertaken audits of the authority. You'll see the policies referenced in the appendices there, and that policy is available to all county council staff via the intranet, with all the supporting material, the codes of practice and the legislation. In a county council scenario, unlike a district, it's a fairly rare occasion in which other services apart from trading standards would need to deploy surveillance. However, we do need to ensure that senior managers across the county council understand the basic principles and the human rights issues relating to surveillance to avoid any unauthorised surveillance taking place. I'll give you a kind of recent example about best practice and what is could be perceived as surveillance in a local authority context that would require authorisation. The commissioners have raised concerns around the use of open source material. So if, for example, we took a Facebook site, a glance at a Facebook site is fine. But if, for example, we get into the realms of a pre-planned systematic process of looking at somebody's Facebook, then that goes beyond the open source material argument and would potentially bring us into a surveillance situation which could require authorization. So it's that kind of guidance that's important to be put onto our intranet sites, so senior managers are aware of where the boundaries are We're satisfied that those checks and balances are in place, and any recent inspections we've passed with no particular major issues. So just to the recommendations, you'll see in paragraph 17, we're suggesting that there should be no changes recommended to the existing policy. It was changed on the previous occasion to reflect legislative changes. It remains fit for purpose and reflects current best practice. So I think it's just a question of putting the recommendation through, and the paper will need to go to Cabinet as it is a policy. That's it from me, Chair, unless I can assist with any questions.
Right. Thank you, Gary. There are some questions I've got. First of all, can I take Terry Richardson?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Gary. I'm more than happy to support the recommendations in the report. I just wanted to ask a little question about that bit you mentioned about how long the turnaround time has increased in court now, and is that turnaround time causing problems in terms of protecting people going forward, and therefore do we perhaps need to make a further recommendation to Cabinet that they might wish the council to write to the appropriate minister, pointing out the threat this brings if courts are not speeded up? So I just wondered what your view on that was.
Okay. I don't think that would be necessary. We have got a link in to the court clerks. It's right to say that earlier on during the pandemic, there were difficulties in getting hearing dates. I think from this perspective, from making an application for surveillance, that we would probably jump the queue. If we could demonstrate by contacting the clerks of the court that it's necessary to get an early hearing. They're a little bit more switched on now in terms of the technology to allow us to do it, and more recently, just generally now in terms of court hearings, we are starting to see some of the delayed cases in relation to prosecutions, both at Crown and magistrates, making their way now to a listed hearing. In fact, we had one 2 weeks ago, and we'd been waiting some time. It was a conviction. In fact, we used quite a lot of this legislation to gather evidence, and it was a road plumbing scam that targeted vulnerable and elderly people. Most of the defendants, I think 4 of them, were imprisoned for these offences, up to a sentence of about 3 years. But what we've been waiting for was in relation to confiscation hearing, to confiscate the assets of these defendants. And 2 weeks ago, thankfully, having waited some 7 or 8 months, we managed to get a hearing. It was dealt with remotely, with the defendant being in HMM MP Ramby. But we made progress, which was pleasing because there was £75,000 involved as compensation for the victims. So in answer to your question, we are starting to see some improvement there. And I think in this context, in relation to surveillance, if it was urgent, we are in a position that we've got fairly good contacts within the listings office that we could probably get this moved forward.
Okay, thank you, Gary. Is that, are you happy with that, Terry?
Yeah, no, it was just thank you for that reassurance, Gary. It was whether addressed we needed to try and put more leverage on through through cabinet writing. But if you're happy, I'm happy.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Terry. James Poland, if I could ask you to put your question forward.
Thank you, Chair. And again, like Terry, very happy with the report and thank you for it. Just really clarifying something you said towards the end of your presentation, really, about open source research. I was just wondering at what point, clarifying understanding what the threshold is. I mean, I used to, in a previous job, I used to work for the police in the vetting team, and we used to open source everybody. I mean, literally everybody that came through. At what point does that become covert? Subject to the RIPA Act?
Yeah, the first issue would be, certainly in a local authority context, we can only deploy these surveillance activities if it's related to essentially serious crime. So a lot of the trading standards cases that involve fraud, for example, that would include that. The decision tree is a tricky one, I have to say. Applying something similar would be if we are considering applying for a directed surveillance to observe a premises, we clearly have to do a drive-by of that premises to establish what's there and what the capability is from a surveillance point of view. So in answer to your question in relation to open source, what the commissioners are saying is that if there is an intention, a pre-planned intention, and it's not an immediate response to an event, so for example a crime being committed where there's evidential material on open source, so if you are pre-planning to obtain information through that surveillance activity about the person's identity, movements and interactions, and it's pre-planned, the commissioners would say you should seek authorization in order to do that, because you are pre-planning that process. It's then down to the privacy element. So without getting into too much complexity on the technology, but it depends how far deep into Facebook you go. I'll give you an example. We have quite a lot of problems now with the sale of counterfeit products and unsafe products via Facebook and via Facebook groups, because people sell things on the Facebook marketplace. It is more intrusive if you decide on a pre-planned investigation that you are going to try and join the group in order to make the purchases, which is often the case with counterfeit products. You have to join the group first and be invited in. That clearly is far more intrusive. But even if you don't do that, if it's a pre-planned investigation in order to gather that evidence and it's over a period of time, then our position is that you would most certainly need to seek authorization, and in that case it would also require judicial approval from the Magistrates Court. But you're right, Mr. Pollard, to say that there are some grey areas, and that's why it's developed, but it's now been added into our policy to remind officers that they need to consider it. The practical reality would be if we had any other departments considering that, they would need to approach an authorising officer anyway in order to get the authorisation, and it's that kind of discussion point we'd had, but it is an area that the commissioners are wanting to tighten up. But that's probably the best way I could explain it.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Gary, for that explanation. Now I have no other questions. I think that's all the questions. So that's fine. So clearly some very rigorous procedures in place to make sure that the power is not abused. Very, very rigorous. So moving to the recommendations then, which set it out on page 69 to 70 of the agenda pack. Regarding the recommendation 1, can I take the report as noted? So I take that as agreed. The committee is also asked to recommend to the Cabinet that the Council's policy statement on the use of RIPA powers remains fit for purpose, and agree to continue to receive an annual report on the use of the RIPA powers and to report to the Cabinet on an annual basis on both the use of the RIPA powers and whether the policy remains fit for purpose. I'm happy to move these two recommendations. Can I have a seconder? Thank you, Terry. So if I have no dissent onto that, I take that as agreed. So there's no dissent, so that is agreed. Right, we now move on to item 9 on the SIPFA Financial Management Code 2021, as set out on pages 75 to 88 of the agenda pack. Nick Walsh, Head of Finance, will present this item. So over to you, please, Nick.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, everybody. This report assesses LCC's compliance with the Financial Management Code, which has been developed by SIPFA. As the background section explains, the code is constructed around 7 financial management standards, or chapters as I refer to in the appendix, and was developed in response to concerns about a number of local authorities' general financial management and resilience. The standards are responsibilities of CFO and leadership team, governance and financial management style, medium to long-term financial management, annual budget, stakeholder engagement and business cases, monitoring performance, and external financial reporting. And in keeping with sort of CITFA's general approach, this code is not prescriptive in terms of what process it expects to see, but instead focuses on assessing that the principles of the code are being satisfied. And the code is required to be implemented for the 2021-22 financial year, hence the reason it's coming to committee now. The appendix to this report is the self-assessment produced to assess the extent of compliance with the code, and an audit will be undertaken by Neil and his team, which will identify any areas of improvement required. We will also need to review this in light of the guidance expected next month from CITFA on the impact of COVID on financial resilience in the sort of the wider sense. That was all I was intending to say by way of introduction, Chair, but happy to take any questions.
Okay, so have I got any questions or comments on the report? It seems to make absolute common sense. I haven't got any questions or comments, so I take that as acceptance as the report as it is written. The committee is asked to comment on the report. There are no comments. Can I take the report as noted, and members agree that all comments now made, well, there are none, be captured in the minutes? So we're quite happy to accept that policy as written, that code. So I take that as agreed. There is no dissent. Okay, so we now move on to item 10, which is the Treasury Management Statement, Strategy Statement and Annual Investment Strategy as set out on pages 89 to 112 of the agenda pack. Nick will again present this item, so once again over to you, Nick, please.
Okay, thank you again, Chair. This report provides an update on the changes to the Treasury Management and Annual Investment Strategy for 2021-22. This strategy is one of a number of strategies that form part of the overall medium-term financial strategy that will be approved by the County Council on the 17th of February. The background section of the report lays out how the Treasury Management Investment Strategy relates to these other strategies. I think the key issue for this committee is to be assured that the Council has appropriate governance in place to adhere to CITFA's Treasury Management Code of Practice and Prudential Code and the related guidance from the Secretary of State. In particular, its approach to investments outside of normal Treasury management activity, which is managed through the Corporate Asset Investment Fund and its associated strategy, which has been considered by Scrutiny Committee and will be considered by Cabinet at its meeting next week, taking account of any comments received from Scrutiny Commission. And as noted in this section, no borrowing has been undertaken by LCC for Corporate Asset Investment Fund investments. Moving on to sort of paragraph 11, members will be aware from the quarterly Treasury Management reports that we've brought to previous meetings that short-term investment options are increasingly limited. So as such, we need to make some changes to reduce the risk of essentially having large sums of money sitting in the bank accounts with nowhere to invest it. The bullet points in paragraph 12 spell out what these changes are. Essentially, they are increasing limits for individual institutions to give us that additional flexibility that's required. We did talk at the last committee about also reconsidering lending to other local authorities subject to appropriate due diligence. However, no changes are required to the strategy as such for this because it is already permitted within the strategy. And because things can move very quickly in the financial markets, paragraph 13 just refers to exceptional circumstances where the Director of Corporate Resources may be required to take action which might breach these limits. And in the case where this happens, it will be reported back to the committee. I wasn't intending to go through the appendix in detail. Much of the content, sorry, is unchanged from last year, albeit some of the numbers have been updated for the latest position. But just to pull out some of the key points of focus in the appendix, paragraph 5 reflects the current borrowing position as at the end of December, 263 million of borrowing offset by 287 million pounds of investments. And the investments will be what we cover in the next item, Chair. Paragraph 6 shows that the council is forecast to be over borrowed by 31 million at the end of this financial year. What that actually means is the level of borrowing we have is 31 million pounds in excess of the capital funding requirement. But going forward, the MTFS actually requires increased capital financing requirement of 146 million pounds, and due to sort of the buoyant internal cash balances, it's not expected that any new external loans will be needed to be undertaken to fund any of this. But however, by the end of the MTFS, the over-borrowed 31 million position will have moved to an under-borrowed position of 88 million pounds. Paragraph 8 shows that the capital financing costs hitting the revenue account are expected to grow from 19 million in 21-22 to 23 million by 24-25. It's worth noting that there will be an additional impact on treasury management returns, as cash balances will be lower as we move through the MTFS period. However, with interest rates expected to remain low, as per the table in paragraph 11, the impact of that will not be that significant. So that was all I was going to pick up for now, Chair. So happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Nick. That was quite clear. And I mean, basically, we're looking at our cash flow borrowing and what assets we invest in, and the reasons in the report for the over borrowing, and you've just explained. But I have two questions. One from Bill Bolter. So, Bill, if I could ask you to put forward your question.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I understand sometimes it's important for the director to make quick decisions, but should it be in consultation with you as well, so you're aware of what he's doing?
Yeah.
Report to committee afterwards, so at the same time, so that you know what's happening. You're responsible for the committee.
Yeah. I am indeed, and I wouldn't object to that. I think it's important they do have the power to act quickly, but I would just ask Nick to comment on that. Would you prepare to do that, Nick?
Well, I think if it's possible, we would certainly do that. I mean, sometimes it might be something as simple as we end up having nowhere to invest money in short term, and we end up having to leave excess money in our bank accounts overnight, which would take us over and above the limit that we have with NatWest. Other times there may be something more specific that we need to do, in which case it would potentially be possible to run it past you before we undertake that action.
Well, that to me sounds very reasonable, and quite honestly, if you have to act immediately, maybe you would refer, even if you could not contact me, maybe you would just advise me later. Would that be more sensible?
Yeah, that's okay. So we will let you know as soon as we possibly can, and then as I said, it will be reported back to the committee at the next meeting anyway as well, so that the committee is aware. Okay,
Bill, does that allay your fears that if we get it at the committee, we'll know what's going on?
Yes, I think that the chairman ought to know what's going on, Chair, not 3 months later. Thank you.
I can't disagree with that. Right, so I've got Geoffrey Kaufman. You've got a question.
Yes, Chair, thank you very much. I don't profess by any means to be an expert on this, but I have been reading in the press that there has been a possibility that the banks may basically charge us for looking after our money. Do we have a contingency for that? Has it ever been discussed? I pick it up. I only know what I read in the papers, and I know it's not always correct, but certainly that has been a concern. I wonder if anyone's got any comments on that.
Yeah, it certainly is a relevant point, but I'll ask Nick to comment, because my knowledge of negative interest rates is not something we've experienced in this country before. Nick?
It is a real potential threat to us coming up in the near future. We're at the point now where our money market funds are actually, some of them have actually moved to zero, and who knows, they may actually move to negative interest rates in the near future. Banks are probably a little bit further away from that, but nonetheless, obviously with the Bank of England base rate at 0.1%, it doesn't take much of a movement for us to get into that position. Obviously, it's difficult to know kind of what contingencies there are to do it, because we always need to have our ability to kind of invest money in short-term measures. But as we would always do, we would always look to sort of manage the position as best we can, given the options we have available to us at any point in time. If negative interest rates come in, we may end up having a cost to having our money sort of stored with the financial institutions. We'll have to deal with that. In actual fact, it might not be overly significant compared to where we are now. We don't get a lot of interest on it. We'll be going from a position where we get very small sums of interest to where we have to pay a very small fee. So in overall financial terms, the difference might be small, but it's just that sort of concept of having to pay for someone to look after your money does obviously really rankle. So we would try and avoid that wherever we possibly could.
Okay, thank you for that. So I now have Sean Sheehan.
Yeah, on that subject, I raised this at Audit and Governance at North West Leicestershire District, and I think it comes down to two choices. You either chase higher returns and accept the greater risk, or you decide you're going to keep your money safe and accept the potentially negative interest rates. And it was the latter course of action that North West Leicestershire said they were going to pursue.
Okay, thank you. I have another. Nick, can I ask you to comment on that?
Yeah, just to support that really, because I think if we ask Link and look at their advice, they would say that the difference between how much interest you get and how much you would pay if we did move to negative interest rates, that the amount that would cost you is probably worth bearing, rather than actually look for increased riskier investments that actually do secure you with some kind of positive return. I think the risk to reward thing would be something we would have to bear in mind. But as I say, Link's advice is probably that it's not worth sort of chasing that positive return, because the additional risk that you may end up going for would probably not be worth it.
Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thanks. I suppose a capital certainly is the key there. Right, I've now got Terry Richardson. Terry, if you would like to ask your question.
It was only really an observation, Chair, and just to support the point Nick just made, and I wouldn't want Nick to respond. I mean, to me, chasing, the only contingency is to chase risky investments, and we know where that's led councils in previous decades. And I would certainly urge it's not a thing we take. I mean, this has been a worldwide phenomenon. I mean, Japan has had negative interest rates now for the last 35 years. I think you've got to take the point that when you've got negative interest rates, there is the benefit on the other side that borrowing is cheaper. So on the term between the two, you tend to be better off. So I would certainly urge that we are prudent and don't chase risky investments, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, that make you're right. The greater the interest rate, the higher the risk, and when given the circumstances, I think that's a very valid point. So with that, the committee is asked to comment on the report, which you have done. Can I take the report as noted, and members agree that all comments now may be captured in the minutes in the usual way? So I don't see any dissent, so I take that as agreed. We now move on to the quarterly Treasury Management Report as set out on pages 113, 120 of the agenda pack. Nick, I'm going to ask you again to present this item, please. So over to you.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'm afraid it's me again. This update covers the period to the end of December 2020, and obviously, kind of follows on from the conversations that we've just been having, really. As usual, there's an economic assessment by Link included as an appendix. Link, obviously, our Treasury Management advisors. The key points from this assessment are included in paragraphs 6 to 9. And I think it's worth noting that their assessment is that the impact of the October lockdown is perhaps not expected to be as severe as the first lockdown that we had in March. And obviously, the next quarterly update will obviously reflect on the latest lockdown as well. There's no change in the inflation expectations. They will remain low for the foreseeable, and so we're not expecting any change there. I think the main point is the potential impact on economic recovery if the government does seek to end or scale down too quickly the various measures currently in place to support businesses, individuals, and in turn the wider economy. Moving on to sort of actions taken during the last quarter. During the quarter, 129.9 million of loans matured, and that was at an average rate of 0.67%. And in the same time, we invested 145.3 million of new loans, and that was the average rate was at 0.24%. We've also received a further 1.3 million from our private debt portfolio, and you'll see from paragraph 11 that in total we've received 3.3 million back, of which 0.4 million was interest, and 2.9 million returned capital. The internal rate of return on this investment is at 4.2%. So whilst it is a small proportion of the overall portfolio, it does contribute significantly to the overall annual returns. And the average rate achieved is continuing to fall as interest rates remain low. Not surprising at all. And obviously there's little we can do about that. It's reduced from 0.69, the average rate in quarter 2, to 0.48% in quarter 3. It's probably worth just noting, though, that without the private debt contribution, this would be down at 0.25%. So, unfortunately, the rate achieved will continue to fall as current investments mature and need to be invested at lower rates. And obviously, private debt is an option, but private debt doesn't really help us with our sort of short-term liquidity, because obviously private debt investments do require us to invest that money over a period of time. The table in paragraph 14 shows the balance on the investment portfolio, the 287 million that I referred to previously. And as mentioned in the previous report, options are becoming increasingly limited, and as such, we are looking to increase limits for individual institutions as we move into the new financial year. Paragraphs 16 and 17 refer to the returns offered by money market funds. These have fallen and have been falling during this financial year. And actually, since the end of quarter 3, 2 of the 4 funds we've used have now fallen to 0%. So as such, there may be an impact on the liquidity of these funds as low rates might prompt significant withdrawals. So that is obviously something we do need to keep an eye on. And the risk would increase further if we move into that negative interest rate territory. So as I say, we'll carefully monitor the liquidity of these funds to make sure that we don't get to a position where we can't take out the funds when we need them. And then finally, the final paragraph just sort of notes that the estimated level of interest to be received on our investments now is 1.3 million by the end of this financial year, which is actually up slightly from quarter 2 due to higher than expected cash balances, mostly arising from slippage on the capital programme. But of course, that is still well below the 2.8 million budgeted figure. So thank you, Chair. That was all I was going to say.
That's a very clear report. Thanks very much, Nick. Now, do I have any questions on that? I think we've addressed most of the issues, and it shows exactly where we are and the sort of scenario that we've been encountering. So there are no questions. Nobody's got any comments to make. So the committee is asked to note the report. Can I take it as noted? Yeah, thank you. I've no dissent. That's fine. So the next item we move on to is item 12. An update on the developments in the local external audit arrangements as set out on page 120 on to 128. We did have the Redmond report and the recommendations, I believe, of the last corporate governance. I will ask Neil Jones, Head of Internal Audit, to present this item. So over to you, Neil.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, you're absolutely right. So this is agenda item 12. And it starts on page 21 of your pack, the update on developments in local audit arrangements. It is actually the third paper I brought to this committee. First one was back in November 2019, and it relates to the independent review of the effectiveness of local, or commonly known as external audit, and the transparency of local authority financial reporting, and more commonly it was known as the Redmond Review. So this report that I'm bringing today completes the circle for the time being, since it outlines the government's response to Redmond's recommendations, which was published just before Christmas last year. So overall, there was a fairly positive response to most of the review's recommendations from the Communities for Local Government, and they've agreed to work with a wide range of key stakeholders to deliver the recommendations. However, paragraph 8 of the report informs that a fundamental recommendation for a new oversight body for local audit wasn't accepted, and the reasons given are spelled out in the paragraph. Nevertheless, the Communities for Local Government have recognised that certain areas need to be addressed, so it's proposed that further engagement with sector leaders can be taken forward in the spring. The remaining paragraphs 9 to 12 of the report very briefly outline those recommendations accepted, including those which are particularly pertinent to this committee regarding governance arrangements for responding to local audit findings, such as the development of a annual local audit report to full council, the considerations for independent members on an audit committee, and the annual standardised statement of service information and costs which would need to be prepared by each authority. And it's likely that if those all come to fruition, this committee will have some oversight of that in its governance role. Excuse me. So next steps are officers from a number of functions will undertake a detailed analysis of the review's recommendations and the government responses, and a further report will be brought back to this committee at the appropriate time. So that's all I have to say, really. It was just a next stage report, and I'll take any questions should there be any.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Neil. That's fairly clear. Has anybody got any comments or questions to ask? I can't see any there. I mean, the Redmond report, it clearly wants to put more onus on elected members to look at the finances, and I think some of the horror stories have come out of other local councils, not this, county councils and local councils. That's what triggered the Redmond report, and we will be addressing that problem in months to come, or exactly where we're going. So the committee is asked to note the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government responses to the Redmond review recommendations. Can I take that as noted? Okay, everybody's in favour of that. So we now move on to the final item, item 13, which is the Internal Audit Services Progress Report as set out on pages 129 to 144 of the agenda pack. Neil, can I ask you again to present this item?
Yes, certainly, Chair. I think it's always the concluding report of the day, to be fair. This is agenda item 13, it's a progress report, and whilst it's a routine report undertaking an outline of work undertaken and our progress with implementing High Import's recommendations, there is an additional section at the back end of the report just on work for the remainder of 2021, taking account of some guidance from SIPFA. So in terms of routine reporting, Appendix 1 in pages 135 to 139 summarises for a 9-week period to the 8th of January our assurance and consulting work, any investigations, etc. that we've taken part in. This is obviously quite a short period against the previous committee, and obviously incorporated the Christmas and New Year breaks. So there is a lot of work still in train, but a great deal to report on closures. Paragraph 6 in the main report explains we've continued to get involved in COVID-related audits, and I have mentioned in the last sentence that further to a request from Mr. Sheehan at the November 20 committee, it's confirmed that assurance work on emergency procurement arrangements is scheduled to begin at the beginning of February. The next part is Appendix 2, which is pages 141 to 144, and this outlines the position with our progressing implementation of high importance recommendations. So starting at the bottom of page 141, continuing on to 142, I just report that the review of direct payments guidance has had to be extended. This is a review by the Adults Department because of other priorities in the department relating to lockdown. This was raised by a question by Mr. Bolter at the November committee. Obviously, we will continue to keep those recommendation progresses in the committee's domain. So in summary on high importance recommendations, paragraph 12, well, there were no new audits that contained high importance recommendations. There were 5 where the original implementation dates have had to be extended to allow management time to both continue service recovery and deal with priorities of the further lockdown. And 2 high importance recommendations have been closed off this period. Finally, for this report, paragraph, excuse me, I've lost my sort of train of thought on this. The remaining paragraphs relate to a project undertaken by CIPFA, which was to look at work undertaken by heads of internal audit over the year. It's been a difficult year for everyone, not alone, and internal auditors have also, if you like, had problems sometimes in engaging with clients because they've been involved in other priorities. Sometimes auditors have been, as in the case of the County Council, had to have some staff that were seconded temporarily. So it has been a difficult year, and the ultimate aim of Head of Internal Audit is that at the end of the year I have to produce an annual report. That annual report has to take account of my opinion on the control environment over the year. So CIPFA were quite proactive in terms of putting some guidance forward in case it was going to be difficult for heads of audit to do that. What it's ended up with doing is me listening to a few webinars around that and understanding where CIPFA is going on that. I don't think we're in a position where I would need to report to the committee. I've had a limitation on scope. We've managed to continue with work. But what's happening now, and I'm just concluding it, is to review the position across all of the work that we've done, just to be confident about that I could, by come the end of the year and for the June committee, I can report that we've managed to provide enough work to substantiate an opinion going forward. So that's in progress, and I'll hopefully take any questions if there are any.
Okay, so thank you, Neil, for the comprehensive report again. So I have one question from Bill Bolter. If I could ask you to put you forward your question or statement.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I'm interested in what this report is always, and Neil always explains things very well, but there's always a little catching it somewhere along the line. And I noticed on Appendix 2, health recharge by the end of December 20. Fine. So we'll see something about that soon, will we? And direct payments, that's been moved to the end of May. That worries me because we've got 35 overdue by 12 months and 99 overdue by 6 to 12 months. I thought it'd been fairly important to have got that done sooner rather than later. And, you know, end of May seems a long way off to me, but I could be.
You've muted. Look. We didn't catch the last bit of that, Bill.
About direct payments moved to the end of May.
Yeah, yeah.
35 overdue by 12 months, 99 overdue by 6 to 12 months. That seems quite a significant error somewhere along the line, and I'd have thought that would have been more important than the end of May. Yeah.
Okay, so these are reviews. So I'll ask Neil to comment on that.
Yeah, firstly, Chair, the Mr. Bolter's reference to the audit above that, which was the health recharges. Yeah, with the right-hand column explains we've actually closed that one off now. We're satisfied that the department has moved that forward sufficiently for me to take that out of any future reports. So that's solved. The direct payments one, yeah, I understand Mr. Bolter's concerns. I don't have any figures in front of me to see how the current overdues reflect on previous positions. I know this not only at Leicestershire but in other organisations, that there has always been a sort of situation where it's playing catch up with reviews of people who are on direct payments, because more people who come on, obviously you need the staff to be able to keep the momentum going. All I can say really is we've had to listen to the department and take a pragmatic view in terms of other priorities that an adults department has got on at the minute, and we're monitoring it, and I'm trying to give Mr. Bolter assurance that we will pick that up in early, probably end of April, early, and then we'd be able to report it through to the June committee.
Okay, so that we'll get a report back on that in June. Bill, does it give you some reassurance? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. But does it slip again? That's the only thing.
Okay. So the report after the committee notes the contents of the routine update. Can I take it as noted? So I take that as agreed. There's no dissent. The next item is the date of the next meeting is scheduled to take place on the Friday, the 4th of June, 2021 at 2 o'clock. I think we're all hoping the world will have changed for the better by then. We may even be able to meet in person. You never know. We can live in hope. The last item is any other items which the chair has decided to take as urgent. There are no other urgent items. So I thank you all very much for your attendance and input today, and I now declare this meeting closed. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Bye, everyone.
Chair.
Bye.